Hi there, welcome to the sew along for the Waterfall cardigan. This pattern is made for knit fabrics. Now you're going to need a fabric with really good stretch. The fabric I'm working with today is a very loose weave sweater knit. It has 100% stretch, so it's really stretchy. You're going to need something with at least 70% stretch to get this to fit properly. It's a body fit, so the back of the garment is designed to fit your curves, so is the arms, and the front of the garment is designed to drape down. So because it's a knit, I've patterned this with 6mm 1/4 inch seam allowances, so when you're ready, set your overlocker up with 4 threads of colour that match your fabric, and make sure the width of the stitching is set to 6mm. Now you're going to need a way of completing the hems for this garment. I'm going to use an overlocker and then a plain sewing machine with a ball needle in it. Make sure you check your tensions on your sewing machines. You might need to lengthen your stitch length slightly from normal. You could also use a twin needle in a domestic sewing machine, which is preferable, or you could use a cover stitcher, of course. This cardigan is a really quick sew. It results in a very flattering garment and it's pretty much an instant result. So when you're ready, we'll get started. Let's start in with the ties. If you don't want ties, just skip this step. So one thing you do need to think about with this garment is when it's being worn, the inside will be shown. So here's the inside of my fabric here. This is very much just like a standard knitted fabric. Just be aware that the upper part of the garment, the reverse will be shown, so make sure you choose your fabric carefully. You might want a double-sided fabric. It might not bother you, certainly because the collar is quite deep. It might give quite an interesting effect too. So here is my tie. As you can tell, my fabric was striped. So what I'm going to do is start by folding this together lengthways, and we need to overlock the edge to secure. So we're going to overlock across one short end and then down one long end to leave it available to turn through the other short end. So there's a couple of things I probably should have mentioned. The first is that we're not going to cut any fabric off when we sew, and the second is there are notches to match as we go, just to keep that even. So when you're ready, turn that through and then repeat for the other piece. So when you've turned that through, go to your iron and press this. Make sure you press it with the seam all the way to the edge. Now the fabric I'm using today is 100% acrylic, and because it's acrylic I'm going to be really careful with my pressing, and I'm going to use a piece of cotton muslin as a press cloth, just because acrylic does have a tendency to melt. So when you've done that, go ahead and repeat that for the other piece. Okay, so once you have your ties all pressed, we can start work on the shoulders. So pop those away somewhere safe and take your back. Now I went and pressed these garments and my iron didn't play nice and spat a little bit on me, but that's fine. We'll just have a few watermarks that should dry out. So we need to take the back and place your back, and this is what your back looks like, right side up. Now you will have a notch in the centre, which is what's going to match to the collars, but for now we're going to concentrate on the shoulders. So place one of the fronts right side down and match the shoulder. So we're working on the left side as you wear it. So what I've got is I've matched the arms like that, so I have right sides together and I'm matching the shoulders. So we're going to sew the shoulder seam here. Make sure your beginnings and ends are exactly together. So then come across to the other shoulder. Find the other front, place it right side down so we have right sides together, and sew the other shoulder. So now we're going to sew in a sleeve. We have two sleeves. They're cut as a pair, which is one this way and one this way, which some people call two mirrors. When we have a look at the sleeve, you'll have a notch in the centre which matches our shoulder seam we've just sewn, and then on one side here you'll have a notch, and that matches a notch at the back of our garment. So you've got a 50-50 chance of getting this right. So take a sleeve and open up the seam that you've just sewn and locate the back notch here. And now I've exaggerated the cut here to show you. So what you want to do is when you place these right side together, that notch should match. Now clearly I've got the wrong sleeve because my notch is on this side, so I'll just use the other side, or you could pick up the other sleeve, whichever you want. And you can see how loose a weave this is. So here is my back notch here, and if I put my sleeve here, the notches will go together. So when I'm overlocking, I'm going to start at the underarm, match the notches there, match the notch at the crown notch, and then we'll come all the way back to the other side. So once you've done that on one side, repeat that for the other sleeve. The other thing about sleeves is it's much easier if you sew it with the sleeve on top. So now we'll work on the underarms and the side seam, and you're going to need the ties. So take one of the sleeves and place it right sides together. We're going to sew up this edge and then through the side seam and insert the tie as we go. Now because I'm going to use my overlocker to do my hems on my sleeves, what I'm going to do now is just overlock secure the end of the sleeve hem. Certainly you don't need to do this now if you're not doing it the same way I am. If you're using a cover stitcher, you can do this later, or a twin needle. So let's start again. So we're going to place that right sides together, and I'm going to sew this from the wrist to the hem through the underarm. When you get to the underarm, make sure those underarms the underarm points match. Now in a perfect world, those seams should be pointing towards the hemline, but because this fabric is bulky, what I'm going to do is just face the seams in different directions. And that's mainly so I don't smash a needle. Now we're coming down towards the waist notch, which is where we're going to be placing our belt tie. So stop before you get to the notch here and take one of your belt ties, and we want to place it into the side seam as we go. So just place the center of this belt on top of the notch, and we want the seam facing towards the hem. Now be careful, because we're going to go through a few layers of fabric there with our overlocker. Make sure you don't break the needles. Just take your time. And you can see how my fabric has the stripe in it. I'm just going to make sure that I pattern match that properly, which I did. Okay, so I'm just going to repeat that on the other side, and as I sew, I'm just going to be careful to make sure that I don't catch the other belt loop in it as I go. So now we're going to sew the miters into the front hem corners. What we're going to do is locate the corner, and then there's a notch. So fold so that notch is exactly on the edge. We're going to overlock from here across to here. So what that does is when we turn it through, that gives us a really nice sharp point to our hem. So repeat that on the other side, so right sides together, find that point with the notch in it, fold on that point and match these raw edges together, and then overlock down. Because when you turn that through, that will help give you the hem position, like so. Now if you're like me here, and it's not sitting quite right when you turn it through, because I want that to be 2 centimeters 3/4 of an inch on this side, and 2 centimeters 3/4 of an inch on this side, what you can do is just go and re-stitch that mitre tighter. You can either do that with a sewing machine or re-go over it with your overlocker. So what I need to do here is just take a teeny bit more of a wedge out of this end. Obviously this has shifted a bit while I was cutting it, and it does do that sometimes, and you can see how it's gone off a bit. So all you need to do is start at the point and then just bring that up slightly, and I'll do that on my plain sewing machine. Okay, so you might, depending on the stretch of your fabric, need to just fiddle a bit with those miters to get them to sit right just for you. But what we're looking for is this. We want 2 centimeters here, which is 3/4 of an inch, and 2 centimeters here, which is 3/4 of an inch, because this is where we're going to be stitching our hem in place. So we want it to sit nice and flat like that. So it's a good idea now, if you're using a cover stitcher or a twin needle, to press the hem into place, so 2 centimeters 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to use my overlocker and a plain stitch to stitch this down, and in theory I probably should have overlocked these edges first before I did the mitre, but most of you will be using a twin needle or a cover stitcher, so that's why I did it that way. So what I'm going to do now is overlock my edges. Now I'm going to overlock from the neck down, around, all the way back to the neck on the other side. Now when I overlock this, because this is going to be turned in like this and stitched down, I want my overlocking to sit on the right side because it's just prettier. So when I start overlocking this, if you are following the way I'm doing it, I'm going to make sure I start right side up at the neck edge. So this is the neck edge on the right hand side as I wear it, and I'm going to take my time just to make sure I get a really pretty overlock, because what's going to happen, because this is a loose weave sweater knit, is some of this is going to come out and you'll be able to see it. You can sort of see it here. So I just want to make sure it's as nice as possible without having to change that overlock stitch at all. I could just use my cover stitcher, but I think for those of you that don't have a cover stitcher, this is probably a good solution. Okay, so I've gone and pressed my hems. You can see the hem turn position by the notch at the centre front here. Now, as you can imagine, being a sweater knit, this has really stretched out of place. You can see it here. If you have the same problem, what you can do is run a line of tack stitching, and I'll just show you very quickly, through the overlocking, or maybe just to one side of it, and gather. So I'll show you what I mean. So just run a line of stitching, and you can do this for just about anything like a curved hem that might pull up, or needs pulling up if you can't press it out into place. So just run a line of stitching, and then from the right side find the thread on top and just pull that up, and what that will do is just help only pull it from the same side on both ends, just like gathering, but all we're doing is just basically just trying to pull it back into shape. So get your stitching on the top. I might as well pull it from this end here, and you can help ease it into place. This works really well with cotton fleece, so cotton sweatshirting. Sometimes that can press out of place a lot, especially if you're trying to do curves. This is a good trick for my hoodie pattern that's been popular at the moment, which is called the base hoodie. It has a very curved hemline, and if you're not careful it can pull out of place. So what we're doing here, you can see it already, we're just slowly starting to pull that hem back into shape, and you can just slightly ease it out. It's the same sort of thing you do if you're trying to set in a sleeve and you're finding there's too much fabric to draw in. You can do the same technique on the stitch line. You can see that's all pulling into place, and you just do the final tweak of that as you're stitching. That's just a really nice little hint to help pull it into place. And you can also do this before you press. You can see that press line is now coming into place quite nicely. So I'll sew the front, and then we'll work on easing that in as we go. Right, so this will be seen when we're wearing the garment, just the upper part, because we'll attach the collar here. So I'm going to make sure I stitch it from the side, and I'm going to stitch it directly through my overlocking line, and I'm going to stitch it at 2 centimeters, but it'll be just short of it because we want to come just in from the edge. And I'll take my time and make sure everything's just nice and straight and looking perfect. And don't forget to have put a ball needle in your machine. So I've gone ahead and put more of those gathering stitches in just to ease things out, and I'm just, now that I've reached the seam, I'm going to just ease it out and make it fit without being too tight or too loose, and continue stitching. And of course, if I'd colour matched this to my fabric, used a pink that I actually had pulled out, but completely forgot to change the thread for the purpose of this video, we'll just continue. What I'm going to do now, but you don't really need to, is I'm just going to go and remove all those gathering threads I put through. So if you don't want to sew the mitre because you're uncomfortable with doing it, or for whatever reason you want to do the straight hem, what we're going to do is just tackle the centre front and the hem in a slightly different way. So this is my collar edge here, so this is the top. First thing I'm going to do is just overlock secure the raw edge of the centre front and the hemline. So what I'm going to do is overlock down, around and back up to the same position on the other side. So this is the position here at the hemline where the mitre would have been. So now what I'm going to do is go to my iron and press those hems into place at 2 centimetres, which is 3/4 of an inch. Right, so I'm going to do exactly what I showed you to do with the previous video sewing the mitre in the sweater knit. I'm going to run a gathering thread through the hemline just for a short distance, just to help me draw in the hemline, make it sit nicer. So this is maybe 6-8 inches, so 15 centimetres from the centre front bottom edge, and this is the hem edge here. I'm just going to run a line of stitches just to help me draw the hem up a little bit. So I'm going to pull this from one side only. I'm going to over pull it and then stretch it back when I start to stitch it. So from the back, I'll smooth it out as I go, but I'll push that back out, and that will just help redraw the hem up at the 2 centimetres, just so I stitch it in the correct place, and by the time I've pushed that out again, that'll all sit perfectly flat and I won't have any tunnelling within the hemline there. So that's the hem on one side, and I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. I'm going to pull a nice tail out and stitch just in that extra curvy bit. Pull the tail out. And then just using the thread on one side, which is the right side, I'm going to draw that up. And I can ease that out when I'm sewing it. Okay, so now I've got that hemline ready to go. What I'm going to do is stitch down the centre front. So when we're sewing this, we want to sew the sides up first, so you can twin needle this or stitch it like I am or cover seam it. So all I'm going to do is run a line of stitching on that 2 centimetre line, and for me that will be directly through the overlocking. And you'll see it's a bit bubbly now, but don't worry about that. Once you've pressed that into place, that should settle down as long as your tensions are balanced properly. So go ahead and do the centre front line on the other side as well. So that's the centre front lines on both sides done. So now I'm going to do the hemline. So I'm just going to trim my overlocking tail back a little bit. And I'll trim off those threads as well. So I'm going to turn that up by 2 centimetres. And when I do it, I'm going to make sure I tuck everything in that hem allowance of 3/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to start off by stitching this just nicely. Just back tack it, just at the edge. And you can tell we need some adjustment here, and that's fine. That will just make sure that the lower centre front looks really nice. So when I turn this up, you'll be able to see where I gathered those threads. And all you need to do now is just adjust the gather to suit. And then smooth it out. So we want to draw it in and then smooth it out. We don't want any bumps or bubbles, we just want a lovely smooth hemline like so. And you can take out that basting line afterwards if you want, or leave it in if you prefer. And as you can see, it's only really needed for that first little bit of the hemline. After that, it seems to be fine, just seems to take care of itself. And then just follow the stitching through to the same position on the other side. Now on this side I'm going to do exactly the same as I did to the other. I'm going to draw this up and then ease it out just to fit the curve. So now I'm going to remove those basting stitches and give the garment a really good press, and then I can move on. So now we're going to work on the collar. Just for the purposes of this video, you won't have a seam in the centre. I've actually changed this pattern piece now. So what we will have is you will have 2 collar pieces. They're really long. And to make it easier to see, I've got one in pink and one in grey. So you will not have the centre seam. What you will have is a notch here at the centre, and you'll also have a notch either side. take one of the collar pieces and go to your iron, and the side that has the notches in it, press a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam into it. That's just to make it a little bit easier to sew into our garment. So when you've pressed that into place, take the other collar piece and match them so we have right sides together. So the notches are going to show us where to sew this to. We'll have a centre back notch and then a shoulder notch. So we want to overlock around 3 sides of this. So we're doing the short end, and then we're doing the side that does not have the notches, that 1 centimetre seam pressed. We want to do these short ends. So the short ends do have a 6mm 1/4 inch seam allowance, but that edge with the notches and the press has a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And now we're going to press this, we're going to overlock this long edge here. So as I mentioned earlier, I've changed this pattern since I cut this out, so there's no seam in the centre. However, if you're patching fabric together and you need to save fabric, when you do overlock that, make sure they sit in opposite directions. So go to your iron, turn this through, go to your iron and give that collar a press, making sure all those edges are pushed all the way out and you've got a nice sharp corner. Okay, so I'm going to show you a way of putting this collar in. That's certainly not traditional. You can put it in whichever way you like. I just thought I'd show you so you could have a different option. So the first thing I'm going to decide is which colour I want on the upper side. So what I mean by that is when this garment is worn, and let's just pop this sleeve through, what's going to happen is that's going to sit open like that. So because I've done a two-sided collar, I can either decide to have it grey side up or I could have pink side up like that. So what I'm going to do is have it so that the grey side is up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my plain stitch to tack stitch the collar into place before I overlock it. So making sure I have the right part of the collar, I'm going to stitch this together, but I'm only going to stitch it to this pink layer here. So it's just like as if you were doing a waistband. We'll top stitch through this folded edge later, but this will come clearer as we sew it. So we do have a 1 centimetre hem allowance, and as you sew this you've just got to make sure you keep that part of the collar out of the way and that is butted right up to the edge there. We're going to overlock this in a second, so it doesn't really pull this up out of the way. Turn the light on. Doesn't have to be perfect, but as close as you can get to 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch, the better. I'm just going to stitch these layers together. It's just a normal stitch. If you're using a regular machine, it would be your lightning bolt stitch. So as we stitch these, we want to match the notch on the collar here to the shoulder seam on this part here of the front. So through the front this is just going to be a tack stitch, but through the back it's going to be a holding stitch. So if there's any ease to be made, just gently put those layers together. And this will give us a guideline for our overlocking too. So here's my notch matching to my seam here, and the seam should face towards the back. And now normally the collar would be on top, but I've got my collar underneath. So the centre of the collar matches to the centred back notch you have on your garment. The same thing, keep stitching those together at 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. And then match the next notch to the next shoulder seam. And then continue stitching across to the front, making sure you keep that collar out of the way, the other side of the collar out of the way the whole time. And that if you need to ease that in, it's all evenly distributed. We don't want any stretching. And you'll find because of that angle, there may be some drape. There's no need to back tack because we're just holding that into place. So now what you can do, if you want to, is fold that down, wrap that round, and stitch that down into place. So if you were doing it that way, the regular way, if you're not comfortable with doing the way that I'm going to show you, what you would do is fold here where we've pressed. You can tidy up those edges. You'd roll this around and you'd stitch this into place, and what you'd do is use the line of stitching underneath as your guide, and you want that to be just in from the edge, so 1/16 of an inch in, 1 mil, and you'd stitch. So the idea is that when that's pulled over, you stitch directly on top of the line underneath. But what I'm going to do is use my overlocker so we don't have to do that. But certainly if you want to do that, go ahead and do that, but I'll show you the way I'm going to do it. Alright, so here is the collar, like so. What I'm going to do is wrap this collar around to create a sandwich with the front, and I'm going to overlock this. Now I'm only going to be able to overlock it, if I'm lucky, as far as the shoulder seam here. And you're going to need to do a little bit of squishing and manipulating to get this right, and you need to make sure that there's no stretching involved. So you need to make sure before you start that those seams are sitting on top of each other and that you don't catch anything as you go. So what I might do is just pop a pin into there. So when I overlock this together, I want to make sure I overlock it to maybe 1 inch, 2.5 centimetres past that seam there. Can you see what I've done here? I'm just going to push this in there. When I start overlocking, I'm going to make sure that that's pushed all the way to the edge. Now the other thing is that we allowed for a 1 centimetre seam, 3/8 of an inch. So what that means is you can use your blade to trim off as you go. So we're going to be trimming off just the edge, so the difference between 1 centimetre and 6 mil, which is 4 mil, or a 3/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. Now I pinned the wrong part of that into place. I should have pinned the notch to that seam. So I'll just readjust that. And you'll be able to see this press line as you go, which should be on the outside of those 2 needles. Okay, so my notch is now matched here. My notch matches here to the seam. And that's where I'm just going to go past and stop. Okay, so when I pull this through, I'll just trim off that slightly. What I've ended up with is this really nice finish to my neckline edge here. Well, it will be by the time I've pressed it into place, so I don't have to worry about having any overlocking seam, and that runs all the way through to the shoulder seam here. So all I have to do now is repeat that on the other side. So here we have it like so. Make sure all that notch is extra deep. There we go. So that notch there, when we pin it, needs to match to that shoulder seam there. So all I'm going to do is wrap this in, bring it around. Takes a bit of squishing and a bit of rearranging. So that notch there matches to that seam there. I'll have to be very careful when I sew that I make sure I catch that. Making sure that's right on the edge. Pushed all the way through. And I'm going to trim as I go. And I need to make sure all of that extra is pushed well out the way. Because I'm sewing on this side, I've got the stitching line as a guideline for the outside of my needle. I'm approaching that seam, so I'll take out my pin, and I want to make sure I cover that notch completely. To come past maybe 2 centimetres, an inch. And pull that through. Lovely finish here to the other side of my collar. So now all I've got to do is go to my machine and top stitch this into place. So because I overlocked through to the shoulder seam here, it makes it very easy to finish top stitching. So we're going to do what you could do, as I said earlier, from the front. I'm just going to start at that shoulder seam. I've already pre-pressed this up, so I'm going to back tack, and what I want to do is make sure this folded edge sits just over my line of stitching, because I want my line of stitching to sit exactly on top of the row of stitching underneath, bearing in mind that as I get to the centre you won't have a centre seam. And we want to stitch just in from the edge, so it's an edge stitch. And because the collar folds over at the back, you'll end up with a really lovely line. And I'm stitching maybe 1/8 of an inch from the edge. only because this fabric is bulky. And I'll go right through to my seam and finish off there. Right, so the very last thing we need to do is our sleeve hems. And our sleeve hem position is marked by a notch here, which is 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to trim my thread of my overlocking chain back to maybe an inch, 2.5 centimeters. I'm going to tuck that inside. I'm going to turn at the notch, and I'm going to stitch that hem into place. Now you can use a twin needle, cover stitcher, whatever you prefer. Now things like cover stitches and twin needles are preferable when you're sewing knits, because any pressure on this will make the seam snap. So when you've done the hem on one side, just go ahead and repeat that on the other side. And as you can tell, I'm starting and finishing with a back tack on the underarm seam. So go ahead and do some quality control work, which means trim off any stray threads and give your garment a final press, and you're finished. Hey, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoy this. It is a very fast sew and a very effective garment. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again soon.